sword in one hand versus sword in one hand. I like to think of this as not necessarily a sword designed for one hand, but just using a sword in one hand. In this case, we are going to use arming swords for the purposes of demonstrating these techniques, but they can be used with a long sword with equal effect. He shows one guard, which is a variation of the tail guard or boar's tooth. In the mounted section, he refers to this post as the tail guard. And he shows that it works well against a cut, a thrust, or even a thrown weapon. You can make your cover. Leanna's going to throw a fendente, and I'm simply going to come up as such. Ideally, come up, we're going to get in a scenario where my point's on the line, and I can step through and thrust her in the throat of the face. That can be very difficult to accomplish. It takes practice. And really what Liberi shows next are what I consider a series of failure drills. You have failed to accomplish the ideal objective, which is to deflect, remain on the line, and come through in a single time with an attack. But in an ideal world, that's what we get. In a less than ideal world, that doesn't happen. Maybe I'm very aggressive in my cover. Leanna deflects very much wide. We have this. She's open, so I'm going to turn my sword, come through with an attack. One option. Other options are, she comes in, we end up in a crossing. I can simply, if my thrust is ineffective, one option is to double up and force through. And he says this is if she was wearing armor. This is what I do. And it's just a more strength attack to defeat her armor. If we end up in a crossing, I have the plays of the first master of dagger available to me. One, he shows the disarm. He shows quite simply being more aggressive and coming in to that middle key. He shows a variation of the disarm, which would apply more to techniques with the sword. Thumb down, I'm on, and here we are. My favorite technique in this part of the system works well, especially when you cover and cross a little wide. Push that elbow, check the weapon, and he shows this, which is just brutal. Another little pass step in, you get behind them, and Leanna's in trouble. He then goes on to show how to deal with the thrust. I'm going to set the point aside. She comes in with the thrust. And if I can, bring that sword to the ground. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to step on the blade, and if I'm very lucky, bend it, break it, or maybe knock it out of her hand. Again, come in. Failure drill. Yeah, can't get the step. I gotta check this arm. I'm committed, I gotta move through. If I back up, we're just gonna repeat the same fight again. Once I get here, checked it, I'm gonna come up, put my leg behind her, throw her, use a long gun. Sword in one hand. So again, these techniques work very well with the longsword. In fact, some of them, like that pummel grab, I think are very much designed for a guy that's employing a longsword against you. He's decided to go one-handed, that pummel's available. Yeah, it's a slightly stronger disarm, better point to attack. Okay.
John, what do you consider to be the context of these techniques?
The sword in one hand?
Yeah.
Well, personally, experimentation, the context of these techniques, I mentioned they apply very well. You see techniques in the mounted section which can be applied in this scenario where you're not mounted. Likewise, these techniques can possibly be applied when you're mounted. Ideally, you are maybe at a disadvantage where you only have a sword that can be held in one hand. These techniques work a little bit better. The cover, the initial cover, is a cornerstone. you do this, you can use this, and we'll see in some other place where you're in this kind of position and you're making these covers. So those are some of the applications. Oh, and lastly, belt on the scabbard on the belt. I think you can do this when the scabbard, and I've experimented myself, I can be done with the right sword, and I think that's a context for this as well. You're here, attack comes in, there's your cover, you're now in the fight.
Okay, so what are you saying there, that it's more of a self-defense circumstance than a battle circumstance?
Yeah, the weapon's something that might be more available to you as opposed to a longsword, where a longsword has specific applications. Battlefield, judicial duel, those types of scenarios. This is more of a civilian sidearm. Not so much in the medieval era, I think, but later, these types of smaller swords become a sidearm. Moving on to the sword in two hands.
Please.